Far more than we think. Making Sense of Spirituality by Angelo. Chapter 10. Perfect Balance. I mentioned in the introduction that I'm an accountant, but actually I'm an ex-accountant. The thing is though, despite having retired from my career some time ago, I still see things in terms of balance sheets. This has been quite helpful in coming to terms with the world as I now see it. The spiritual and scientific views of the universe are that we live in a relative world. This means everything exists relative to something else. The easiest way to think about this is to consider darkness and light. If there were no darkness, then light could not exist. If everything was bright light, a new light could not be seen, because it would be lost in the existing light. In order for any little bit of light to be visible, it has to exist against a background of lesser light, or no light at all. There will of course be a range of intensities, all the way from the brightest light to pitch black darkness, and every shade of light and dark in between. This simple idea applies to everything that we can think of. For example, positive and negative, good and evil, hot and cold, male and female, rich and poor, heaven and hell, and so on. In order for any one thing to exist in relative terms, we need its opposite to exist as well. This then gives rise to the possibility for the numerous shades of existence to fit between these two extremes. This relative view sits comfortably with an accountant because for us everything is a zero-sum game. The debits and credits always have to match up exactly, and the balance sheet should always balance. If the accounts do not reconcile, we instantly know something is wrong. Everything has to stay in perfect balance. This concept of balance can apply at both the macro and micro levels. The Big Bang theory, for example, seems to suggest that the universe erupted out of nothing. This is difficult to contemplate until we embrace the idea of a relative world in perfect balance. If we look at it from a numeric standpoint, and we start with 0, then if plus 1 comes into existence, we also need minus 1 to exist in order to maintain balance. Likewise, if plus 2 comes into existence, we need minus 2. So now we have plus 1 and plus 2, minus 1 and minus 2, all existing together, and the net total is 0. Which of course is where we started. We can have any quantity and size of positive numbers running into trillions of trillions, provided we have the equal and opposite value of negative numbers. In fact, the positives and the negatives can be infinitely large and numerous, and still all balance out to 0. This perspective of balance can apply not only to the physical world, but to every aspect of energy in life, including our own thoughts and feelings. This is obviously a simplistic view of the incredible complexity of the universe, which science continues to explore. However, this overarching principle can help a great deal in understanding and accepting many things in life that we tend not to like or to agree with. We can't have the good stuff without the bad stuff. The universal balance sheet is always in perfect balance. Having positives and negatives is the natural order of things. Everything exists relative to something else, and it all just has to be. We know this to be true because that is the way it is, even if we don't like it. Contrasts and contradictions exist all around us. This type of thinking has also gradually helped me understand and accept the contradictions that seem to exist within me. Let's look for a moment at a range of emotions from positive to negative, each of which I can relate to and have experienced at some point in my life. Love, faith, joy, happiness, serenity, pleasure, empowerment, freedom, passion, enthusiasm, excitement, appreciation, belief, optimism, hopefulness, contentment, security, boredom, pessimism, frustration, irritation, impatience, disappointment, stress, doubt, worry, blame, discouragement, rejection, jealousy, anger, revenge, hatred, guilt, insecurity, unworthiness, grief, depression, powerlessness, victimhood, despair, and fear. Well, that is a fair old roller coaster of emotions. Yet, I imagine most of us can relate to many of these feelings. We might be a bit reluctant to admit to some of them, but an honest assessment will probably find each of them lurking somewhere. I'm no longer ashamed to admit that all these feelings exist as part of me, and they are quite capable of surfacing if certain triggers occur in my life. This seems obvious when I set it out like this, but it was not always the case for me that I could so easily admit these things. My ego was not only very strong, it was rather lopsided. I was proud of my positive attributes and feelings, and worked hard to present this picture to the outside world. At the same time, I had all of the negative feelings and potential behaviours within me, and this caused me guilt and shame. I didn't like this negative side of myself and tried to keep it hidden. I resorted to external fixes to help me cope, but this inward repression of my true self caused depression and suffering. Eventually, the lid blew off the whole melting pot of emotions, and I ended up in a real mess. Other people have different coping strategies, and some vent their feelings through aggressive and sometimes seemingly inexplicable behaviours. We all have darkness and light within us. The point of telling you this is not to make excuses for my own behaviour, but to suggest that each of us has all of these emotions and potential behaviours built into us. It's what we can call human nature. My own experience and observation is that any one of us is capable of the most wonderful acts of love, compassion and kindness, but we also have the capacity to commit the most extreme acts of selfishness if circumstances arise and we consider it necessary. If we add in the effect of mind-altering substances, the negative end of this spectrum can become even more shameful. The potential depravity of human behaviour is truly shocking, and yet most of us will believe that our actions are justified, given the truths that we hold in our minds at any given moment. Quote, "There's so much good in the worst of us, and so much bad in the best of us, that it hardly behooves any of us to talk about the rest of us." Close quote. Edward Wallace Hawke. The recognition of the goodness and badness of human nature is another way of explaining the duality of a loving spirit and a fear-based ego. This more enlightened way of viewing human behaviour has had positive benefits for me. Instead of idolizing good people and condemning bad people, I now see that everyone has exactly the same core set of emotions and potential behaviors. Once I combine this with the idea of oneness, this makes yet more sense. Each of us are manifestations of the same universal source energy, expressing ourselves in a myriad of different ways. Our core spiritual selves are all the same, but our expressions of that spirituality are unique. When we add in the understanding of the cycle of the mind, we see that everyone's behavior is driven by the truths that they hold. People who have not been exposed to the concept of spirituality will perceive life from the position of their own ego. This will mainly hold imagined truths and will behave accordingly. This does not make anyone a bad person, nor does it necessarily make them ignorant. Knowledge itself is binary. We either know something or we don't. If we don't know something, nobody is to blame. It's just simply the case that we don't know. Sometimes we will hear the same thing over and over again in different forms and guises, yet we will still not know it as true unless and until the penny drops and it finally makes sense. This may take many decades, as it did with me, or indeed it may never happen at all. However, once we do see the perfect balance in the world at large and the underlying causes of our collective behaviours, it begins to make acceptance and tolerance of others much easier. Judgment and condemnation are gradually replaced by understanding and compassion. I'll admit this doesn't happen straight away in every situation, but acceptance does start to come once the enlarged cycle of the mind begins to work its magic. The other incredible benefit of this more balanced perspective on life is the ability to finally forgive ourselves for our own behaviour. I've been my harshest critic in the past. For any number of things that I did well, I would beat myself up for the one thing I did poorly. My sense of self-criticism was so strong that any compliments I received simply bounced off my hard shell of low self-esteem. I did things I didn't want to do in order to court praise from others, but then felt bad afterwards because I knew I'd betrayed my own inner truth. I compromised my own truths in the expectation that there would be some reward, but then became resentful when those rewards were not forthcoming. Conditional love was doomed to failure because these things rarely transpired as I wanted them to. I was looking externally for love because I did not love myself. I didn't even like myself most of the time. This is obviously not a good recipe for happiness. In extremis, these types of feelings lead us to self-destructive thoughts and behaviours. I know this because it happened to me and nearly cost me the ultimate price. It was from a very low point indeed that I began in earnest to seek answers, and what I've found is far better and more fulfilling than I could ever possibly have thought possible. Spirituality has given me the opportunity to finally forgive my own shortcomings and accept myself for who I am. It's given me a glimpse into who I really could be and an opportunity to grow towards that vision. It's allowed me to look inside myself with love rather than with fear. And what I find is that I have everything I need and desire already within me. There is darkness inside me, but there's also light, both existing in perfect balance. It's up to me to decide what I choose to express in my life, and I choose the light. I choose love rather than fear. And there's no need for me to judge myself anymore. There's also no need for me to worry about being judged by others either, or indeed for me to waste time and energy casting judgments elsewhere. I simply love myself and accept myself as I am. My inner demons tend to fade away when I own them and embrace them. That old feeling of inner struggle is occasionally replaced by a new feeling of serenity. The challenge is to keep choosing love in all situations rather than allowing the old fearful habits to resurface. This may sound a bit narcissistic, and I must admit that it does take some getting used to. If we love ourselves from a position of ego, this leads to arrogance and narcissism. But if we love ourselves from a position of spirit, this opens up the inner world. Self-love is neither narcissistic nor egotistical, because it allows us to become more loving towards others. We hold the key to the door of our own inner resources, which in turn can be shared. Once we grasp this idea, the idea of personal heaven on earth comes more into focus. We achieve this not by grabbing the external things that we can lay our hands on, but by letting go of our ego and embracing our own loving spirit. It sounds too easy and too good to be true, but I can assure you that we really do have all that we need already within us. Many people live their entire lives without ever realizing this astonishingly simple truth. Everything can be seen as being in perfect balance. This applies to everything and everyone, including ourselves. We are far more than we think, and we each have the internal resources to make heaven on earth our personal reality. And this is true whatever our external circumstances may be, and however harshly we may have previously judged our past behaviour. Quote, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven." Close quote. That's by John Milton. What's been interesting for me to experience and observe is that once spirituality becomes the guiding principle in our lives, our own moral compass seems to take over, and we intuitively know the right decision in any circumstance. We now know instinctively how to behave. I'm not a saint, but I do have a deep sense of honesty and a loving respect for my fellow human beings and for the environment in which we live. I generally choose to do the right thing because it feels like the right thing to do. Sometimes I may think of doing the wrong thing, but now it no longer feels right. This may sound a bit boring, but actually a new life based on spirit rather than ego leads to a great deal of inner peace and contentment. It's a life based on love rather than fear. And this is the choice that we can all make at any time. We can choose to stay in the perceived safety of ego and limit the potential of our lives, or we can break free and live a life that's beyond our imagination.